Now, you mentioned that that has not obviously been the easiest road to hoe for women, even in the United States, as far as thriving at the same rate and climbing as high and as far as men have been able to do over time. And as someone who embodies what women, tools, and technology really is all about, I'd love for you to give us your own insights into what sparked your launch, into your current position as really a thought leader and as someone who truly represents what success and in being a woman, in being an entrepreneur, and infusing all of these ideas together. I'd love to get your insights on that.
So, if you go back 20 years, you would have seen that I was a women's rights and civil rights activist, and that I had no role in what was then a very early technology development in the United States. So my path is necessarily a traditional one to what I'm doing today, but I came to technology from a passion for women's rights, civil rights, and human rights. And at some point, which is now close to 20 years ago, I began to see that these tools were going to be transformative, and that all of the policy work that I had done and all the, that all of these questions were going to transfer, that equality would be played out on a much different kind of field than the one that I had been operating in. I also noticed at that point how few women were paying attention to the internet, to new technologies, to the capacity to transform, who had power and who had the capacity to speak and who had economic empowerment. And I began through a variety of projects that I was involved in to basically learn these issues from the bottom up. I am not a technologist. I now speak the language. But I'm a lawyer by training, a civil rights lawyer by training. And there were just a number of early issues in the United States around free expression online, around who was going to have access to the new technologies that I was involved in, about whether or not we would fund bringing new technologies into schools and libraries, about whether or not we would build our new technologies on top of freedom or on top of censorship. And from my involvement in those issues, I began more and more to work in this space, and then 5 years ago took over this wonderful organization. So you never really know where life takes you, and you just kind of leave yourself open for the opportunities. What I love about the work that I'm doing here is that, for most of my career, I was very, very focused just on the United States. Now, in working to create an open, innovative, and free internet, and to try to, create policies globally as well as in the United States that support that, I feel like also playing a role in human rights around the world. So, I'm very grateful to have wound up here at this point in my career.
Well, it's really been a tremendous career, and we're obviously incredibly inspired by your work and all of your efforts. Leslie, I would love for a minute if you could tell us a bit about, tell us what democracy and technology is. Tell us about this business that is really leading the way for women in technology. I'd love you to give us some insight onto that.
Well, so we are a non-governmental organization. There were only a few of us in the advocacy or NGO sector that are women working specifically on technology. And we are lawyers, and then we are computer scientists and technologists. And our principal work is not to build technologies, but to make sure that in governments and United Nations and all kinds of multilateral policy bodies around the world, that the policies that are being adopted will ensure that more and more people have access to the technologies. They will be technologies of freedom, that they will not be controlled by governments, controlled by individuals, that media will have rights on the internet. So that's the kind of work, trying to work out what are the right policies for dealing with protecting kids and at the same time ensuring freedom. What are the right policies that companies ought to be adopting, because they're a very, very important part of bringing the internet to the world. How do they ensure that they're protecting human rights when they're trying to provide the infrastructure for communications and information services in countries that have bad human rights records? How do we assure free speech for bloggers? So we're not that big. We're a fairly small NGO in the world of really big ones, but I think we're pretty effective.
Yeah, I would say small but mighty.
Well, that's me too. I'm not very big.
Well, you as well are small but mighty, and you've played.
I don't know about mighty, but I am small.
Well, we think you're quite mighty, and powerful in small packages, we say. You played a lead role in landmark internet legislation for the E-rate program, which brought the power of the internet to rural and inner-city classrooms and public libraries. How do you think this can be translated in rural areas globally with little infrastructure and no electricity, and what training could be provided to communities such as those so that they could overcome those kinds of conditions?
Well, Terry, I'm not a development expert, so that's a hard question. In the United States, by the program that we were able to put together here, many communities that had never seen the internet and did not have a lot of money, basically we used something in the United States called the Universal Service Fund, which is something that companies have to pay into to support. If they're going to make money in the country in big cities, information and communications companies, then they pay into a fund that helps pay for these kinds of services in rural areas. And I don't know how many countries have adopted that kind of model, but it's one way to get resources into the areas that companies do not see as economically viable for building out services. Here in the United States, for education, in small rural areas who really didn't have access to, a wide range of educational resources, we're using everything from satellite to, we don't tend to use solar in the United States because we at least have, the electrical wiring out to everywhere. I think again, it's a real question of government policy. It's got to start with a government that's willing and companies that are willing to make investments in areas that they may not be making money from immediately in order to raise the standard of living, raise the education, and eventually raise the country. And that's sometimes a hard sell. It's much easier to just keep providing those services in the cities where there's more education and more users. And I think in large parts of the world, it's only mobile that has started to get out of the cities and reach, into the rural areas. But you have to make demands on government, and you have to make demands on the companies doing quite well for themselves.
So do you see any possible overlap in the ways that you brought ICTS to rural America that could be translated on the rural global community?